In 2012, a wolf in Yellowstone known to researchers as 755M lost his mate and his pack in the same season. He didn't find a new pack. He didn't leave the territory. He stayed in the same range, alone, for nearly 2 years. Researchers tracked him the entire time. What they documented wasn't just the behavior of a lone wolf. It was something that looked, by every measurable indicator, like grief settling into something permanent. 755M ate less than the data predicted for a wolf his size. He traveled the same routes he had traveled with his pack, covering the same ground in the same patterns, alone. He didn't establish a new territory. He didn't challenge other wolves for status. He just kept moving through the landscape that had contained his entire social world long after that world was gone. Field researchers who had spent years documenting wolf behavior in Yellowstone described his movements as purposeless in a way they hadn't encountered before. Not the purposelessness of a young wolf finding its range. Something quieter than that. Something that didn't resolve. Social loss in highly bonded mammals produces a measurable physiological response. Cortisol levels rise and stay elevated. Immune function drops. Sleep architecture changes, documented in wolves, primates, and cetaceans using non-invasive monitoring methods developed in the last 15 years. The body responds to the absence of known companions the way it responds to a chronic threat, not a predator, not hunger. The absence itself registers as danger. This is not metaphor. The hypothalamus doesn't distinguish cleanly between physical threat and social deprivation. Both activate the same stress cascade. Both produce the same downstream effects on the immune system, the cardiovascular system, the brain. In humans, chronic loneliness has been associated with elevated inflammatory markers at levels comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The same inflammatory markers appear in socially isolated primates. The same cortisol elevation appears in isolated wolves. The biology is not reading the situation the way we assume it should. It is reading the absence of others as a survival emergency. What makes this finding stranger than it first appears is the evolutionary logic behind it. The stress response exists to protect the animal. Pain signals tissue damage. Fear signals physical threat. Both drive behaviors that address the problem directly. But the stress response to social isolation doesn't work that way. An isolated wolf can't produce companions through cortisol. An isolated elephant can't rebuild its herd through elevated inflammatory markers. The biology responds as though the problem is solvable by the same mechanisms that solve physical threats. It isn't, which means the animal is running an emergency system that can't reach a resolution indefinitely. Researchers studying the long-term effects of social isolation in wild populations have documented something they call the isolation cascade. It begins with the physiological stress response. It progresses to behavioral changes, reduced foraging efficiency, disrupted sleep, decreased exploratory behavior. In the third phase, documented most clearly in primates and cetaceans, the animal begins to show what researchers describe as attentional narrowing. The range of stimuli the animal actively processes contracts. It responds to fewer things, engages with its environment less. The world, in some functional sense, gets smaller. The question of whether animals experience something like loneliness, not just the biology of social deprivation, but the subjective weight of it, runs into the same wall every question about animal inner life eventually hits. You cannot ask. You can only observe what the body does and what the behavior signals, and then decide how much you're willing to read into the convergence. Elephants make that decision difficult. Elephant herds are matriarchal, multi-generational, and defined by bonds that persist across decades. When a matriarch dies or a herd is separated, the behavioral changes in remaining individuals are well documented. But the cases that draw the most attention from researchers are the ones involving solitary elephants, individuals separated from their herds through poaching, habitat fragmentation, or circumstance, living alone in ranges that should contain dozens. Joyce Poole, who has spent decades studying elephant communication and behavior, has documented solitary male elephants engaging in behaviors that serve no obvious biological function in isolation. Vocalizations directed at no one, repeated movements through areas where other elephants had previously been present, standing still for extended periods at water sources that had historically been gathering points for groups. The behaviors are not random. They are oriented towards something absent. The difficulty is that elephants in normal social contexts produce these same behaviors as social signals, vocalizations to locate group members, return movements to known gathering sites, stillness at water as a waiting posture. In a solitary elephant, the same behaviors continue without a recipient. The signal is still being sent. There is no one to receive it. The elephant isn't producing a new behavior in response to isolation. It is continuing an old one past the point of function. The social behavior was built into its repertoire so deeply that isolation doesn't switch it off. It just removes the context that gave it meaning. The elephant keeps transmitting. Nothing answers. Orca pods are among the most stable social units in the animal kingdom. A pod typically consists of a matriarch, her adult offspring, and their offspring animals that may spend their entire lives spanning decades within the same group. The bonds within a pod are not just behavioral, they are linguistic. Each pod develops its own dialect, a specific set of calls distinct from every other pod in the same population. The dialect is learned, maintained, and passed down. It is, by any functional definition, a cultural artifact. When an orca is separated from its pod, either through death of all other members or through capture, the behavioral documentation is consistent across multiple cases. The animal continues to produce its pod's dialect. Alone, with no other pod members to communicate with, it keeps using the calls it learned from its family. Researchers have recorded solitary orcas vocalizing for hours. The calls go unanswered. The animal produces them anyway. There is no survival explanation for this. A solitary orca calling in its pod's dialect cannot attract other orcas. Different pods don't typically merge, and the dialect itself marks the caller as belonging to a group that no longer exists. The call serves no foraging function, no territorial function, no mating function. The only thing it was ever for was contact with specific others, and the animal keeps making it after those others are gone. Primates offer the most controlled data because they are the most studied. Research on rhesus macaques separated from social groups shows cognitive changes within weeks of isolation. Problem-solving ability drops. Anxiety-related behaviors increase. The prefrontal cortex, the region governing flexible decision-making and emotional regulation, shows reduced activity. These are not permanent changes, and young animals return to social contact quickly. In animals kept isolated longer, the brain physically reorganizes around the absence of others. Franz de Waal, who spent decades studying primate social behavior, argued that what researchers tend to call stress responses in isolated primates are better understood as a single integrated system, that the social bond is not an addition to the animal's biology, but a component of it, as necessary to normal function as food or sleep. The isolated animal isn't just unhappy, it is incomplete in a way the body registers as structural. The data from captive studies supports this at a neurological level that field research can only approximate. Isolated primates show measurable reduction in dendritic branching in the prefrontal cortex. The physical connections between neurons that support complex thought literally decrease in number. The brain is not just functioning differently, it is, in a measurable sense, becoming structurally different. Social contact is not an input the brain processes. It is an input the brain requires to maintain its own architecture. If the brain requires social input to maintain its structure, then the brain of a social animal in isolation is not operating at its normal capacity. It is operating on less than it was built to run on. The solitary wolf isn't just lonely. It is, in a neurological sense, less than it was when it had a pack. The connections that supported whatever 755M was capable of thinking and feeling and processing are fewer in isolation than they were before. The absence doesn't just feel like something. It changes what the animal is able to feel. The harder question is what the animal knows about its own condition. Whether the wolf traveling his old routes understands what is missing. Whether the elephant vocalizing into empty air knows there is no one to hear it. Whether the orca calling in a dialect that belongs to a group that no longer exists is doing something that carries any interior weight at all. Or whether it is simply running a behavior the loss of context hasn't switched off. This is not a question the behavioral data can answer. The data shows the behavior continuing. It shows the physiology of distress. It shows the brain reorganizing. What it cannot show is whether any of this is experienced, whether the wolf, covering the same ground for the 100th time, carries something like the weight of knowing what used to be there. 755M eventually joined a new pack in late 2013. His behavior shifted within weeks. His cortisol levels, estimated through non-invasive fecal sampling, returned toward normal range. Whatever had accumulated in those 2 years appeared to resolve, at least in the ways the data could measure. He was killed by a hunter shortly after. The records are conflicted on exact timing, and researchers who had tracked him for years described his file as one of the most complete behavioral portraits of wolf solitude ever documented. What the file doesn't contain is the interior of those 2 years. The data shows a wolf moving through a territory alone. It shows the biology of a body under chronic stress. It shows behavior that continued past the point of function. What it doesn't show is what any of it was like, whether the roots felt different without the others, whether the silence registered as absence or simply as silence, whether 755M, in any sense that the word can carry, missed them. The orca is still calling somewhere. The elephant is still standing at the water. The wolf covered his ground until he didn't anymore. What the data accumulated across all of them suggests is this: the social bond in highly bonded mammals is not a preference, it is a biological requirement with measurable consequences when it goes unmet. The body treats its absence as an emergency. The behavior reflects something that continues past the point of any practical function. The brain reorganizes around it. Whether that constitutes loneliness in any meaningful sense is a question the science is still building toward. The animals don't answer it. They just keep behaving as though the absence is something, as though the frequency is worth keeping open, as though somewhere in the territory, in the water, in the dialect of a group that no longer exists, there is still something worth calling toward.